5 seconds is nothing. Blink slowly and you have used one of them. Take a single deep breath and you have used 3. 5 seconds is the time it takes to read a short sentence, to glance out a window, to decide what to have for breakfast. In the scale of a human life, 5 seconds is essentially invisible, but physics does not care about human scales. And if gravity, the force that has governed every single interaction between every piece of matter in the observable universe since the first moments after the Big Bang, were to simply stop for 5 seconds, those 5 seconds would be the most catastrophic event in the history of this planet, possibly the last event in the history of this planet. Not because of what falls during those 5 seconds, because of what happens when gravity comes back. Before walking through the sequence of events, it is worth being precise about what gravity actually is, because the popular understanding of it is incomplete in ways that matter for this thought experiment. Gravity is not a force in the way that pushing a box across a floor is a force. Einstein's general theory of relativity, which remains our best description of gravity more than a century after it was published, describes gravity as the curvature of space-time caused by the presence of mass and energy. Massive objects curve the fabric of space-time around them, and other objects follow the curves of that fabric. What we experience as the pull of gravity is actually the geometry of space-time directing objects along the straightest possible paths through a curved universe. This means that switching gravity off is not simply turning off a magnet. It would require fundamentally altering the relationship between mass and space-time across the entire universe simultaneously. The physics of how this could happen does not exist within any current framework. This is a pure thought experiment, but thought experiments are how physics has made some of its greatest advances, and this one is worth following carefully, because what it reveals about the role of gravity in maintaining the world we take for granted is genuinely extraordinary. The moment gravity stops, everything on Earth that is not physically attached to something else becomes a projectile. Start with the atmosphere. The atmosphere is held against the planet by gravity. Every molecule of air, from the dense nitrogen and oxygen at sea level to the thin wisps of gas at the edge of space, is in a continuous gravitational negotiation with the Earth. Remove that negotiation instantly, and the atmosphere does not wait. Gas molecules are in constant rapid motion, bouncing off each other at hundreds of meters per second. Gravity is the only thing preventing them from simply flying away into space. Without it, the atmosphere begins expanding outward immediately, not slowly, not gradually, but at the speed of the gas molecules themselves. The oceans follow the same logic. Water is liquid. It holds its shape only because gravity pulls it into the lowest available positions. Without gravity, surface tension, the weak electromagnetic force that makes water bead on surfaces, would pull ocean water into spherical droplets. But the ocean is far too massive for surface tension to dominate. The kinetic energy of water molecules in motion, normally directed downward by gravity, suddenly has no preferred direction. Enormous masses of water would begin moving outward from the surface in all directions, a slow-motion explosion of liquid covering 71% of the planet's surface. The ground itself is more stable in the immediate term. Solid rock is held together primarily by electromagnetic forces between atoms and molecules, not by gravity. The rocks do not fly apart the moment gravity stops, but anything sitting on the surface, soil, loose sediment, buildings, vehicles, trees, animals, people, all of it becomes subject only to whatever velocity it currently has. Since the Earth is rotating at roughly 1,000 miles per hour at the equator, everything on the surface has that rotational velocity. Normally, gravity curves this velocity into a circular path that keeps everything on the surface. Without gravity, that velocity becomes a straight line tangent to the Earth's surface. Everything on the surface, every person, every building, every tree, every car, begins moving in a straight line away from the planet at whatever speed the Earth's rotation imparted to them. Near the equator, this is fast enough to feel immediately. Near the poles, the rotational velocity is much lower, and the initial departure is much slower. But everywhere on Earth, the surface is no longer a surface that holds anything. 5 seconds pass. In those 5 seconds, a person standing at the equator has traveled roughly 70 meters away from the Earth's surface, moving in a straight line at the rotational velocity of the planet. Not dramatically far, not yet lost in space, but moving fast in a direction that is now not toward anything. The atmosphere has begun expanding outward, but has not dispersed significantly in 5 seconds. Most of the air is still in the vicinity of the Earth. The oceans have begun deforming, but have not gone far. The moon, which orbits Earth in a delicate gravitational balance, has begun traveling in a straight line rather than a curve, departing its orbit silently and without drama. The Earth's interior is where the most structurally significant thing is happening. The planet's layers, the solid inner core, The liquid outer core, the mantle, and the crust are held in their configurations by enormous gravitational pressure. The inner core is solid, not because of temperature, which is actually hot enough to melt iron, but because the pressure from all the rock above it, driven by gravity, compresses it into a solid state. Remove that pressure instantaneously, and the inner core begins to change phase, the solid iron beginning to transition toward liquid as the pressure that maintained its solidity vanishes. The liquid outer core, which generates Earth's magnetic field through its churning convective motion, is similarly affected. Its fluid dynamics depend on the interaction of gravity, rotation, and heat. Without gravity, the convective patterns that drive the dynamo generating the magnetic field begin to change immediately. 5 seconds is not long enough for these deep interior changes to propagate to the surface. The speed of sound through rock, which is how pressure changes travel through solid Earth, is roughly 5 to 8 kilometers per second. In 5 seconds, a pressure change at the core would travel at most 40 kilometers outward, barely scratching the mantle. The surface would not yet feel what is beginning to happen below. Gravity returns. This is where 5 seconds of absence becomes an extinction-level event. Everything that left the surface, every person, every building, every cubic meter of ocean water, every molecule of atmosphere that expanded outward, every particle of loose soil and debris, is now in a position above the Earth's surface with a velocity directed away from the planet. Gravity returning does not gently reverse this. Gravity returning means that everything above the surface immediately begins accelerating back toward the planet at 9.8 meters per second squared. Objects that were 70 meters above the surface when gravity returns hit the ground in roughly 4 seconds, traveling at about 37 meters per second when they arrive. That is 83 miles per hour. Every person who was standing on a surface anywhere on Earth hits that surface at 83 miles per hour. Every object that was resting on a table, a shelf, a vehicle, or a structure hits whatever is below it at the same speed. The contents of every building hit the floors simultaneously at 83 miles per hour. Every vehicle on every road hits the road surface at 83 miles per hour. But that is the least of it. The oceans are the catastrophe. An average of 70 meters of water across 71% of the planet's surface has moved outward from the Earth. When gravity returns, that water falls back. All of it, simultaneously. The kinetic energy of the world's oceans falling 70 meters and striking the ocean floor and coastlines simultaneously is beyond the scale of any event in recorded human history. The impact waves generated by billions of cubic kilometers of water returning to the surface at high velocity would dwarf any tsunami ever recorded. Every coastline on Earth by waves of a scale that has no historical comparison. The atmosphere returning is similarly violent. Compressed air that had expanded outward rushes back toward the surface, creating pressure waves traveling at the speed of sound in all directions. The atmospheric return would generate a global pressure event. A sudden compression of air against every surface on Earth, equivalent to a simultaneous detonation across the entire planet. Beneath the surface, the consequences of 5 seconds of lost interior pressure begin propagating outward with the speed of seismic waves. The partial phase change in the inner core, the disruption of the outer core's convective dynamics, and the sudden pressure changes in the mantle all generate seismic activity of a kind that has never been recorded. The mantle, which behaves like a solid over short time periods, but like a viscous fluid over geological time, would not have had time to flow significantly in 5 seconds. But the sudden pressure changes would propagate through it as seismic waves, arriving at the surface as ground motion. The return of gravity combined with the structural disturbance of the interior would likely trigger simultaneous seismic and volcanic activity at a scale that geological history has no record of. Every fault line on Earth responding simultaneously to the sudden pressure changes would produce a global earthquake event. Every volcanic system that was already in a state of near eruption would be pushed over the threshold by the disruption of the pressure systems maintaining their equilibrium. The moon's departure during the 5-second window adds another dimension. Even 5 seconds of straight-line travel at the moon's orbital velocity of about 1 kilometer per second would move it roughly 5 kilometers from its orbital path. When gravity returns, the moon does not simply snap back to its orbit. It returns to a gravitational interaction with Earth from a slightly different position with a slightly different velocity vector. The resulting orbital perturbation would be small but not zero, and its effects on Earth's tidal systems, axial stability, and long-term orbital dynamics would compound over subsequent astronomical time. The Sun, 150 million kilometers away, would barely register 5 seconds of Earth's altered gravitational state. Light from Earth takes 8 minutes to reach the Sun. The gravitational influence of Earth on the Sun is minuscule. On this scale, 5 seconds is genuinely nothing. It is worth pausing here to let the asymmetry of this scenario settle. 5 seconds of absence. 5 seconds during which nothing moves catastrophically far, nothing completely leaves, nothing is irretrievably lost in space. By the measure of distance traveled in 5 seconds, the damage seems containable. 70 meters, a few minutes of re-entry, surely recoverable. But physics does not care about distance. Physics cares about energy. The kinetic energy of the world's oceans, atmosphere, and surface material falling back to Earth simultaneously is not a recoverable event. The seismic consequences of the interior pressure disruption are not a recoverable event. The civilizational consequences of every structure, vehicle, and living thing on Earth hitting the ground at 83 miles per hour simultaneously are not a recoverable event. The 5 seconds of absence is not the disaster. The return is the disaster. Gravity is so constant, so universal, so perfectly present at every moment of every day that it functions as the invisible architecture of everything. Not just the architecture of planets and orbits and the large-scale structure of the universe. The architecture of your body, which evolved in a specific gravitational field. The architecture of every building ever designed, every bridge ever engineered, every ship ever floated, every aircraft ever lifted. All of it designed around the assumption that gravity is constant, universal, and permanent. That assumption has never been wrong. Not once. Not for a fraction of a second in the entire history of the solar system. The thought experiment of removing it for 5 seconds is useful, not because 5 seconds without gravity is a realistic scenario. It is useful because it forces a confrontation with how completely everything depends on something that is never acknowledged, never noticed, and never thanked. Gravity is the most important force in your life, and you have almost certainly never spent a conscious moment being grateful for it. 5 seconds. The time it takes to read a short sentence. The time it takes to glance out a window. The most catastrophic event in the history of this planet. And it would be over before most people had processed that something had changed. The world would not end in the 5 seconds that gravity was gone. It would end in the 5 seconds after it came back. And the universe would continue, indifferent as always, having barely noticed that one small rocky planet had a very bad moment in an otherwise uneventful Tuesday afternoon.